Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. In this week's episode, I'm unpacking the paper titled Computational Sophistication of Games Programmed by Children, a Model for Its Measurement. And it was written by Linda Werner, Jill Denner, Shannon Campe, and David M. Torres. As always, you can find a link to this paper in the show notes, as well as links to the author's Google Scholar profiles, so you can read more works by them. Simply visit the show notes by clicking on the link in the app that you're listening to this on, or by visiting jaredoleary.com, and there you will find the citation for this particular article, as well as many other show notes that are relevant to this particular episode. All right, so the abstract for this paper reads as follows, quote, "This article builds on prior work that aims to measure computational learning, CL, during middle school. Since game computational sophistication, GCS, has been used as a proxy for a student's engagement in CL, we build on their model to more completely describe the relationship between different types of building blocks of computer games and GCS. In doing so, we present a single quantitative measurement for GCS. Our model, called GCS 2.0, has face validity for 39 games, each programmed by a pair of middle school children. We choose 4 of these games, 2 with high GCS and 2 with low GCS, and discuss the computational building blocks found in each game. We do this to help the reader better understand our measurement of GCS and its relationship to CL." End quote. Okay, so if I were to summarize this article into a single sentence, I would describe it as an article that unpacks how the authors updated the game computational sophistication model, GCS, to account for computational learning evident within 39 games developed by pairs of middle school children. So the article itself is organized around the question, quote, "How can we improve the game computational sophistication model to make it easier to use for assessing the computational learning of middle school children programming games?" End quote. That question is from page 12:2, and I modified it slightly to actually just speak out the acronyms. So the authors begin the article by citing Cooper et al.'s suggestion, quote, "that for education at the K-12 level, we should be focusing on computational learning, since it emphasizes the central role that a computer can play in enhancing the learning process and improving achievement of K-12 students in STEM and other courses." End quote. That quote is from page 12:1. However, the authors also suggest that one of the problems for widespread adoption of CT is that it's very difficult to measure students' learning when engaging in computational thinking activities. So here's a quote from Chris Stevenson. And Chris is Google's head of computer science education programs. So this quote kind of builds on the sentiment that I just previously mentioned. Quote, "I'm not sure yet that we understand enough about how to measure computational thinking, knowledge, and learning. Even in our own discipline space, let alone across other disciplines, there are little pieces. But there isn't really anything comprehensive around which we can construct a real framework for assessment yet." End quote. So that's from pages 12:1 to 12:2. So one space where middle school kids and high school kids are engaging in computational learning is through programming video games, which the authors cite as kind of a medium for promoting computational knowledge and skills in a way that is often motivating for kids. I'm sure we can all think of the kids that we work with that are highly motivated by video games, myself being one of them, even though I'm not a kid, although that's debatable sometimes. Catch me in an amusement park with roller coasters, and I will be like a child, running around from ride to ride. Anyways, so the review of literature in this particular article cites other articles related to developing CT frameworks. However, many of the studies that they cite did not actually focus on programming video games specifically, or did so in a way that was not easily scalable and transferable to other programming languages. So the GCS model that they are using in this particular study is, quote, "based on the analysis of 231 games programmed by 325 11 to 12-year-olds using the Alice programming environment," end quote. That's from page 12:3. And the authors provide a helpful summary of how this model aligns with a framework for how novice programmers learn how to code, and that's on page 12:3, which I recommend taking a look at. However, the authors suggested the original GCS model, while it may have been helpful for some cases, it was not distilled down to a single assessment that could be used to analyze student work, specifically using quantitative measurements. So this particular article tries to remedy that. So the study itself looked at a 12-week-long voluntary after-school program where 39 pairs of middle school kids across 4 different schools spent about 2 hours per week programming games in Alice, which is a 3D storytelling and game environment. And I'll include a link to it in the show notes, just in case you want to actually try it out in your class or just for funsies. So to actually analyze the games that were submitted by these 39 pairs, they had 2 undergrads analyze all 39 games, quote, for programming constructs, patterns, and game mechanics based on the original GCS model, end quote, from page 12:4. And if you're into inter-rater reliability, they were at 97.84%. And if you're not into that, that basically means that the 2 undergrads who analyzed the games independently, so on their own, when they came together and compared their scores or labels that they used on the code, it came to the same conclusion about 97.84% of the time, which is really high. Okay, so the next main section of this particular article kind of unpacks what the 2.0 version of GCS is. So on page 12:5, there is a table that lists the programming patterns used during analysis of a project and what level each pattern is considered from simple to complex. Simple being a level 1 and complex being a level 3. And each one of the levels, you could get a score from 0 to the maximum level. So level 1 can have a score of 0 or 1, level 2 can have 0, 1, and 2, and a level 3 can have a score of 0, 1, 2, or 3. So for example, writing code that controls an object or camera with the mouse or keyboard is considered a level 1 pattern, while programming a vehicle to cause objects within the vehicle to move in unison is a level 2 skill. So what that specifically means is like if like your sprite jumps into a car and then the car starts and it starts driving away, we want the person that's inside the car to also go with it. So they move in unison. Otherwise, it would just be like, all right, the car goes zooming off and the sprite is still sitting there floating in the air. And as an example of a level 3 skill, creating a timer that causes something to occur when the timer hits a certain time or a threshold. So if you want to see all of the 21 patterns, check out page 12:5. And each one of them includes the name of the pattern, what skill it is considered to be, what level, and then a description of what that pattern is. Okay, now the second main portion of this particular model on 12:2 are the game mechanics, which include mechanics such as like player interaction or levels or puzzles or racing or shooting or whatever. Now, the way the patterns and the mechanics work together is they kind of come together to create an overall score or rating for a particular project. So they do so by adding up the game mechanics score with the pattern score. Now, the game mechanics score is basically a formula that accounts for the number of mechanics used in the game. So for example, if you have a game that has multiple levels, has player interaction, and is a racing game, that's 3 different kinds of game mechanics that are being used. But if it only has player interaction, that would be 1. Now, the pattern score is another formula that accounts for the number of overall quality patterns used within the game. So for example, if you use nested if-else conditionals, that is 1 type of pattern, and if you use counters, that's another type of pattern, so you'd have 2. And depending on how well you use them, you'd get a different score for each one of those. So the authors explain how they came up with the algorithms for the scores, and then provide some hypothetical examples of how a game might score using the formula, if it's a quality game or a low quality game, in terms of level of sophistication. And their description does get pretty granular, so if you're really interested in learning more about exactly how this model works, they spell it out pretty good. So next, the authors provide 2 case studies of a high-scoring game, and then 2 case studies of a low-scoring game. So I recommend you read those if you want to see some examples of, well, what would a high-scoring game look like in Alice, and what would a low-scoring game look like? So in the discussion section of this paper, the author suggests that the GCS model could be used with other programming languages outside of Alice alone. So for example, it could be applied into Scratch, or Ruby, or Swift, or JavaScript. However, they note that the specific patterns and mechanics would need to then be translated over into other languages or platforms. So if you're like super excited about this GCS model and you want to apply it into a language other than Alice, you're going to have to do some translating before you can actually use it in your classroom on those other platforms. But if you look at the appendices at the very bottom, it's several pages long and it spells out each one of the patterns and mechanics. So it should be relatively easy for you to kind of create your own version of this. The authors also note in the discussion that they were looking at the product created by 2 people rather than what each person individually learned. And this is important because we cannot make the assumption that each person has the same understanding as their partner when collaborating on a project. For example, I'm sure we've all worked with groups or seen groups where one person knows significantly more than another, and they're able to work together on a project. Now, speaking of working together, one of the really interesting findings related to the partnering was that, quote, students who reported higher levels of friendship with their partners at the beginning of the course had lower GCS scores at the end. No other significant correlations were found, end quote. So that's on page 12:15. Now, this is absolutely fascinating, and I would love to see some follow-up on this. Why is it that in this particular study, students who were friends or had higher levels of friendship ended up scoring lower on their overall product than students who had lower friendships at the start of this course? I would love to see some follow-up studies that explore this more, or even to have the authors on this particular podcast so that way I can kind of ask them what they think, hypothetically, might have caused this. So in the conclusion section of this article, the authors suggest that this model can be helpful for assessing computational learning. However, they explicitly state, quote, we do not suggest that the GCS 2.0 assessment model be used as a standalone end-of-course assessment of programming skills, end quote. It's from page 12:15. Instead, what they recommend is pairing this with other assessment frameworks. So for example, they recommend pairing it with self-evaluation. Now, this is something that I was really hoping that they'd mention in the conclusion, and I'm so glad they did. I strongly agree with this. You can't rely on one assessment or one assessment type in any class that you're working with. You need to be constantly engaging in formative, summative, and ipsative assessments throughout a class to kind of get a more of a holistic approach to understanding what your kids actually know and can do. And I could talk for hours about why that is very important, but I'm going to instead kind of point to some resources that unpack it a little bit more in the show notes. All right, so as always, I now want to kind of share some of my lingering questions or thoughts. Now, these questions and lingering thoughts are not meant as a critique of the article or the authors. They're simply my own ponderings or wonderments that came out of reading the article itself. So one of the things that I was thinking of is I'm curious how this model would differ if the analysis was based on the process rather than the product. So in particular, if we looked at this from a constructivist perspective, the idea that knowledge is socially constructed and individually understood, and therefore is unknowable, rather than a constructionist perspective, which is based off of Papert's ideas that we've talked about in this podcast before, and is the idea that like knowledge is constructed through active creating, whether that be like creating a game, like in this particular article, or maybe building a rocking chair out of wood, or even creating some kind of a mental model or something. All of those are like acts of constructionist practices. So in other words, what I'm wondering is, what if we analyze the learning evident through the social interaction and the overall process rather than the end product result? How would that have changed this model and the things that would have been looked at or discussed or labeled or assessed? Now, again, the authors do note that this type of assessment should not be like a standalone, the only form of assessment you engage in, the summative assessment. So it could be paired with more process-based assessments. But I'm wondering in particular about the model itself, how it would have differed if it was looking at the code throughout the process rather than code as the end result. So as an example, for another question that I was kind of thinking of, is how might the model differ if it also accounted for code that was initially included or attempted, but ultimately removed from the final product? So the authors do account for what they call non-operational code, which is like the code that's in the game, but it doesn't actually work or wasn't finalized. So it's kind of like off on the side, not really doing anything. But I'm curious, what about the code that was deleted? Because I'm sure we've all kind of like worked on stuff where maybe you're creating something and you start tinkering with something and then you go, you know what? I don't like this idea, or I have another idea, and you just erase a portion of what you had previously worked on. What would those things that were erased have potentially shown in terms of student understanding? So another question that I had is, how might educators use this model in combination with ipsative assessments? So ipsative assessments are, quote, an assessment the student makes against their own performance so that they are measuring their personal progression against their own previous work, end quote. Now this quote is from an article by Savage and Foutley, which I will link to in the show notes. So in other words, it's kind of like a self-reflective assessment where you kind of compare your own understanding with your prior understandings. So if you were to take this GCS model and do it multiple times and go, okay, the previous time I used the GCS model on my project, I scored, let's say, a 10. But now I scored a 12. Why is that? What about my learning has changed? How are these two projects rated differently? And what does that say about my own understanding over time? So let's say a month ago, I was rated at that, but then I incorporated X, Y, and Z patterns or game mechanics, and now I'm rated at this higher score. What does that say about my own learning? Now, one of the things I like to also do with ipsative assessment is to go one step further and then kind of predict their own future learning. So when kids engage in ipsative assessments in the classes that I work with, they would reflect on what they learned in relation to their prior learning, but then I'd have them think through, okay, what is it that you want to learn next? What are you missing, or what do you want to expand upon or dive deeper into with your next project that you're going to start? Because again, we can always learn more. We can always dive deeper. So even if you get a 100% on this project, what next? So the next question that I had for this article was, how might this model account for variances in complexity evident across the different patterns and mechanics? So for example, the nested if-else statements are listed as a level 1 pattern, which means that they can only receive the maximum score of 1, while timers are listed as a level 3 pattern, which can receive a maximum score of 3. However, I can think of several games where the use of a timer is much simpler than the nested conditionals. In particular, you can dive several layers deep in different branches of nested conditionals. Whereas a timer might be simply initializing a variable, creating a loop, changing the variable by 1, and then waiting a second. That's it. So as another example, a counter is listed as a level 3 pattern, which again can have a maximum score of 3, while embedded methods are listed as a level 1 pattern. And methods, again, are basically another name for functions. And in this case, I again can think of many examples where keeping score by changing a variable can be much simpler than sprites that have several functions embedded within other functions. So my last question while reading through this article was, how could a model like this account for sophistication evident with the efficiency of code? So in the show notes, I'll include a link to a tweet where this was multiple years ago, I shared out how I was working on this infinite drum set, and I took the snare code and I narrowed it down from 64 lines of code to 9 lines of code, all while maintaining the exact same functionality. In other words, my code was much more efficient in terms of the amount of overall space it was using and its just overall design. So when thinking of instances like that, how could this model also account for efficiency in code? Because at the moment, it's just, are you using these patterns and are you using these mechanics? Not necessarily how efficiently or effectively are you using them. And again, that's not a critique on the authors or the article itself. I do highly recommend people read through this, and I would love to hear how people are using this potential model inside their classroom. Now, with all that being said, just a quick reminder that if you're interested in checking out some of the resources I mentioned, like the assessment stuff or trying out Alice, just click on the show notes for this particular episode, and it has several links in there. If you enjoyed this episode, I hope you consider sharing it with somebody else. For example, do you know a middle school computer science educator who'd be really interested in learning more about different assessment types? If so, share this with him, and they'll probably be like, "Thanks, person, I appreciate you." With that being said, thank you so much for listening to this episode. Stay tuned next week for another interview, and then 2 weeks from now, another Unpacking Scholarship episode. Hope you all have a wonderful week.